Hey, I'm Kevin and welcome back to part 2 of a 2-part series on how I made this shaker style coffee table. If you haven't seen part 1, I show you how I made this tabletop complete with Padauk, maple, and walnut segmented center, as well as breadboard ends. For part 2, I'm going to show you how I made this carcass as well as a drawer so you can hold all your blankets. Well, that's enough of an intro, let's just jump right into it. To optimize my time and use lumber appropriately with as little waste as possible, I laid out all my pieces within SketchUp to know how much wood I need and the dimensions. To get started, I started by breaking down the lumber as the stock was much thicker than I needed. Rough sawn lumber has a lot of stress in it, and you can see here that I had to flip my board over while ripping it because it was pinching my blade. Do not try to force your wood through it as you could damage your table saw or even worse, kick back and injure yourself. Like I did for the tabletop, I used the table saw to remove most of the extra material and the planer would finish it up. Before I did the final surfacing, I let the wood sit and relieve stress so that it would minimize any more movement. Thickness for all my rails came out to be 4/4. So now I can start ripping down the board so I can cut the rails. I made the rails 2 inches wide so that they can match the legs. I wanted to have this consistent look throughout the table. Since this is my priciest project, I wanted to leave no room for error. I set up a feather board so I can have even pressure as I fed the boards through the saw. I could chop all the pieces for the rails at the miter saw, but without a sufficient miter station, I felt more comfortable with making repeat cuts with a crosscut sled and stop block. For the longer pieces, I just measured and snuck up on the line. The last pieces I have to prepare are the stock for the legs, which are milled down to 2x2s. So what I have here is the layout for the panels and legs, and they would be connected by tenons here and here. The original plan was to use mortise and tenons for all the joinery, and the panel would be small like this. But I wasn't a fan of this size and space, so I decided to use dowel joinery for the vertical pieces. With the design change, I proceeded with the build. To start the joinery, I began with marking for the mortises. You can create the mortises a number of ways, with a mortiser, a drill press, or a router like I did here. The tenons will be 1 inch in length, so I used the thickness of the rail to set my router plunge depth. Using a spiral upcut bit, I removed as much waste as I could without touching the lines I made. If I had an edge guide, this would require little to no cleanup with a chisel. Since I don't have an edge guide, that is exactly what I did. I sharpened my chisels before I cleaned up the mortises. And rinse and repeat. Now that all the mortises are made, I can get started on the tenons. You could cut them by hand, on a bandsaw, or using a dado stack like I'm using here. Just to be safe, I clamp the rails to my miter gauge so that they don't move while I make the cuts. This makes for quick work as I just have to flip the rail over and cut the other side. The tenon fits just right with some wiggle room for when the glue is added. Like I said before, for the vertical rails, I'm going to use dowels to join them together. This was also very easy as I just had to mark the rails, line up the jig, and drill the holes. To complete the panels, I have to cut down plywood to fit inside. I had to do a little bit of work on this because I wanted to use 1/4 inch ply and the store near me only had 1/8 inch and I thought this was just a little too thin. So I decided to laminate 2 pieces of 1/8 inch together to get that thickness. While the exterior is a walnut ply, the inside is red oak, but it doesn't matter as it won't be seen. One other thing I had to do was fix the tanning that happened on this wood. Part of the wood was exposed to the sun for a long time. This is what it originally looked like, and up here is where the sun changed the color. To fix this, I just laid the board out in the sun for a couple hours as I worked on other things, and that helped even the color out. I am now cutting a dado into all the rails so that I can accept the plywood sheets. To make the dado perfectly centered, I made a cut, flipped it around, and sent it through again. Now that the sheet is ready, it can be cut to size. The panels on 3 sides of the table are all made the same, but the false drawer front is made slightly different. I wanted to use 3/4 inch plywood on the drawer front because I knew I had to attach a drawer pull and attach it to the drawer on the inside. So rather than sliding the 3/4 ply into the dado slot, I'm going to cut rabbets into these rails. You may notice that I'm not doing stop rabbets and that I'm cutting them on the table saw. I figured that since it will only be seen from the side when the drawer is open, I would just add a patch and re-drill the holes for the dowels. If I were to do this again, I definitely would have done stop rabbets with a router to do this the proper way. Now all the rails are finally ready for assembly. I started with the drawer rails and then moved on to the sides. Before inserting the plywood, I gave it a final sanding as it would be easier to get into the corners. I know what you're thinking, why didn't you apply finish to the plywood panels before inserting them? Well, hindsight is 20/20, isn't it? It actually wasn't too difficult to finish the panels afterwards. Well, you live and you learn. At this point, the drawer rails are dried and I can cut the 3/4 inch ply to fit into the drawer front. Before I attached the panels to the legs, I gave everything a quick sanding, breaking the sharp corners and putting a chamfer on the bottom of the leg so that it doesn't tear out if the table is dragged on the ground. Now we can glue it all together. I did the 2 shorter sides first and then did the long side, pulling it all together with the longest clamps I own. For the front, I cut 2 thin rails that will bring the table square but will also make stops for the drawer. You can see here how I attach them, but I also threw in some pocket holes in the bottom for some extra strength. Now we're going to make this shelf right here. This is also made from 3/4 inch plywood. I chose plywood because it's cheaper and we don't need it to be made out of solid wood as we won't be able to see it all. If you've seen my computer desk build video, I am making this shelf just like I made the shelves for the desk. By placing down the painter's tape, I can use a jigsaw to cut out the corners with little to no tear out. The only thing different this time is that I'm adding hardwood strips as edge banding to cover up the plywood edge. Before I put the shelf in place, I'm adding this divider to give the shelf support in the middle. Here's where I got to see how square my table is, and since it was a snug fit, I think it was pretty close to square. If there are any small gaps, you could fill them with a mixture of sawdust and glue. The legs are strong enough to hold up the tabletop, but to secure it down, I'm adding a skirt. Rather than doing a bunch of extra work to do half-blind mortise and tenons, I'm just using pocket holes as they won't be seen. I use the same finish that I use for the tabletop, making sure to get into every nook and cranny. Some of the pieces may have been easier to finish before assembly, but it actually wasn't that bad. The only thing left to do is to make this drawer and this custom drawer pull. Before I build the drawer, I have to build out the inside some so I have something to attach the runners to. With some extra pieces of ply sandwiched together, I glued and tacked them into place. I also used a scrap piece as a spacer to make them level. Now I'm taking the dimensions for the drawer. Here's a fun little tip to get the exact width you need. With a couple clamps and a couple pieces of scrap, you can stretch these across the distance for a snug fit. The only thing you have to remember is to subtract the thickness of your drawer runners. For my case, I just had to subtract 1 inch. To accept the bottom panel of the drawer, I am cutting in a dado on the front and the side panels. For the back, I cut all the way through so that I can slide the bottom in and out if I ever need to replace it. To put these all together, I went with pocket screws. I first tacked them into place and used a right angle to keep them square. You can see here that the bottom panel slides in, and to keep it from coming out, I screwed it into place. For the finish on the drawer, I went with some polyacrylic for faster drying time. When that is cured, I can go ahead and install the drawer. You could see that the drawer was a perfect fit. Now I'm going to work on this custom drawer pull. While the handle is just a 1x1, the hardware is made from a coupling from the hardware store. It first started like this, and then ended up looking like this. This is very easy to do without metal working tools. I put it on a threaded rod and threw it into my power drill. With some low grit sandpaper, I knocked off all the corners and made it round. Once it is round, you can polish it up by working up the grits, removing the scratches. To attach it to the handle, I cut down the threaded rod and drilled a hole for that rod. I used epoxy to fill all the gaps and lock the wood to the threaded rod. On the false drawer front, I found the location for the pulls and countersink on the back to hide the hex bolt being used. Now I can attach the drawer front. All there's left to do is to attach the tabletop, and to do this I'm using a biscuit cutting router bit to make slots for the tabletop fasteners. These are Z-clips that I picked up from Rockler that allow for wood movement throughout the seasons. This has been my most ambitious project yet, and I am extremely happy with the way it has turned out. Though I had a couple of hiccups and design changes, the experience was fantastic, as it was the first time I worked with rough sawn lumber, used a dado stack, done regular mortise and tenons, and made breadboard ends. I am definitely a fan of doing more finer woodworking projects, and I'm looking forward to doing many more in the future. Alright guys, thanks for watching, and if you're not already subscribed to the Kevbotworkshop, click right down here so you don't miss out on any new videos. Remember to hit that bell icon so you can get a notification when they come out. Click right over here if you haven't seen part 1 of this series, or right down here if you'd like to see another project. That's it for now, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time in the Kevbotworkshop.